Okay, so we had given out documents to each school, public, private, you name it, in Blair County. We were looking for that one student, and we got quite a few incredible students. And the purpose was, after we gave these out, to have them each write us an essay, 500 words or more. I had to obviously do with the Constitution. And as I said, they were fabulous. They really were. And it was very, very difficult to pick the winner. I'll tell you, it wasn't easy. But we had 3 finalists. As I said, they're here. And I'd like for them to come up. I'm going to name the winner last, although they know, well, I know the winner knows who the winner is. Rachel, and there's no order here, but Rachel McIntosh and Brandon Lashinsky were 2 of the finalists. And our winner this year was Hunter DeRensis. Did I get it right, Hunter?
Yeah.
Really? Come on up. We have you're going to be pretty amazed. But I want to tell you that Rachel is attending Liberty University. She's going to be majoring in public relations, advertising, international relations. Her career path is as a corporate attorney. And we had a lot of fun talking about that. We kind of got away from the subject matter and learned more about them. It was really pretty cool. Brandon is not here. Hopefully he will be here shortly. Brandon Lashinsky is attending St. Vincent. He's going to be a political science major. Hasn't quite decided his career path. I told him, don't feel pressured, but that's where it is. So first I want to... This is the book, The Constitution of the United States of America, and also selected writings from many of our founding fathers. So I thought this would be very appropriate. Thank you very much. Don't see Brandon, because I would see him coming this way. So, without further ado, Hunter, if you would come up. Hunter is going to be attending George Mason University. He's going to major in history. His career path is public service and statesmanship. Many of his family members and his mother are here with him today. I'll let you guess what public service and statesmanship is. But Hunter, I want to thank you. I'll get this to Rachel. And this is for you, Hunter. And we have a book and a shirt, but we also have a plaque. This is our first time, and we were very excited about it. And 2014 Blair County Tea Party Patriot Scholarship, Hunter DeRensis.
Hi everybody, it's great to be here. We got a fantastic day out, great turnout. This is just wonderful. All right, I'm going to read the essay that I turned in for the scholarship as a speech. I'm sorry if I have to read it, but unlike our current president, I don't have a teleprompter. During the writing of and preceding ratification of poor roads, a mail system controlled by political opponents, and soothsaying from such documents as the Federalist Papers. However, this did not stop their intellectual leaders, such noted anti-federalists as Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and George Mason, from lobbying constantly for a Declaration of Rights, added amendments that would put further restrictions on government power to protect individual liberty and state sovereignty. Their efforts culminated in the adoption of the Bill of Rights in 1791. The first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution protect such things as the right to own a firearm, to a speedy trial by jury, to be free of cruel and unusual punishment, and that all powers not explicitly given to the federal government remain in the hands of the states and the people. But when speaking about which amendment has had the widest influence, and in whose absence would have altered American history and culture the most, that title clearly falls to the First Amendment. Protecting such actions as freedom of speech, free press, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition, it has been assailed by opponents since its creation and has continued to be the bulwark of individual liberties for over 2 centuries. More specifically, the freedoms of speech, press, and religion have been the most crucial, constantly coming to the forefront of political issues. It is with these 3 in mind that the historical context and importance of the First Amendment will be viewed below. Less than a decade after coming into law, the First Amendment received its first blow under the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Signed into law by President John Adams, the acts were direct, 2-pronged attacks on the political opposition, the Democratic Republicans. Adams himself represented the Federalist Party, an elitist organization that favored increasing the power of the federal government, intervention in Europe's burgeoning Napoleonic Wars, and the continuation of the mercantilist policies of former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who was Adams' bitter rival within the party. The Democratic Republicans opposed the Federalists on all of the previous issues, and for that they were deemed enemies of the state. These bills made it illegal to criticize the president in the press and attempt to mute opposition to an increasingly unpopular Adams as he began fighting the quasi-war with France. The Naturalization Act was an attack on recent immigrants that increased the years of residency required for citizenship and gave the president the power to deport at whim. Since most recent immigrants were Democratic Republicans, this was directly aimed at hurting the party's base. For the next few years, speech was censored at will. People were actively deported, fines were imposed, and multiple people went to prison, including a sitting congressman. The Democratic Republicans, and importantly the country, pushed back against these tyrannical acts imposed on them by an even then growing federal government. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were penned by Thomas Jefferson, at the time Vice President, and James Madison, respectively, arguing that states had the power to nullify and disobey federal laws that were unconstitutional. In the presidential election of 1800, with the Alien and Sedition Acts as a background, Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans to a landslide victory over Adams and the Federalists, who would never again elect a president under their banner. The 4 laws that composed the acts were either allowed to expire or were repealed in 1801 and 1802. This is because until 1801, the Supreme Court had not yet bestowed upon themselves the power of judicial review. The Alien and Sedition Acts were blatantly unconstitutional, an obvious diagnosis by the same generation who crafted the Constitution. If the First Amendment had been absent, Adams's attempt to curtail free speech and press would have become legitimized in American jurisprudence. Jefferson and Madison would have had no legal basis with which to justify nullification. The Republican experiment in America would have ended after only a decade of governance. But due to the resistance and perseverance of regular people, the true carriers of the torch of human liberty, the Alien and Sedition Acts were expunged from the law books and the First Amendment stood triumphant. The next major test came 60 years later during what has become known as the American Civil War. While minor attempts to crush opposing opinions took place during the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, they pale in comparison to the actions taken by the Lincoln administration. Beginning in April 1861, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in the state of Maryland and later in the entire country. An arrest order was issued for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, who publicly opposed this action as unconstitutional. Over 13,000 Americans were arrested for opposing the war effort that would end in the deaths of more than 670,000 people. Over 300 northern newspapers were forcibly shut down for printing items opposing the government's actions. The first military draft was issued in American history, forcing men into the ranks of the military. A senator was expelled from his seat and a congressman deported, both for acknowledging the Confederate States' government. It was said that the only place free speech existed in the North was its prisons. For a number of years, the U.S. government operated as a military dictatorship that used its monopoly of force to extinguish the words written in the Bill of Rights, and specifically, the First Amendment. But as Jefferson had stood up to defend the First Amendment, new men stood up to oppose the militant bureaucracy of radical Republicans created by the war. The actions in defense of the U.S. Constitution by President Andrew Johnson, at the cost of his popularity and almost his presidency, and the pro-liberty presidential campaign of Horatio Seymour energized the country. By the end of the 1870s, constitutional rule had returned to the American government after years of restlessness. If the First Amendment had not been crystallized into the American political culture, it is likely that there would have been no blowback to Lincoln's actions, or his detractors would have been tepid at best. The heights reached during the Gilded Age would not have occurred. Half of the country would still stand under the military boot of the other half. Individual liberty would have been sacrificed to the cause of the Union. But once again, the First Amendment and its wisdoms were snatched from the jaws of defeat by the American patriots who believed in constitutionalism and sovereignty. As the United States returned to a civil government and a regular two-party structure, new issues came to the forefront of politics. These issues included protective tariffs, civil service reform, military pensions, and what this paragraph will focus on, the growing strength of pietism. Pietism, a fundamentalist version of Christianity, began as a religious revival in the 1830s, and by the 1880s had spread like wildfire throughout the North. They believed that they should use the government, acting as a social arm of the church, to stamp out sin and temptation. They wanted to transform the world into the image of Christ. This meant a suppression of Catholic immigration, support for public schools in the Calvinist tradition as opposed to private parochial schools, keeping Sunday sacred, and the complete prohibition of alcohol. These religious beliefs quickly became political divisions, and for a time American politics resembled the religious parties of old Europe. The Pietists, mostly consisting of New England Yankees, quickly took over the Republican Party. The Democrats, on the other hand, came to represent the liturgicals, mostly Catholics and Lutherans. While the competition between the parties at this time was fierce, they were prevented, specifically the Pietists were prevented, from gaining absolute control due to the fact that the First Amendment prevents an establishment of religion. The First Amendment, instead of coming under attack as in previous examples, stood as a bulwark against religious encroachment into people's lives. Despite their lack of absolute victory, most pietist policies were eventually instituted. Public schools soon became commonplace as Anglo-Saxon ideals were instituted, and high-minded progressive intellectuals, acting as cultural imperialists, continually attacked the Catholic Church as foreign and immoral. Prohibition was eventually instituted in 1920, although it was eventually repealed in 1933 after its disastrous effects were felt nationally. And limitations were put on immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe as a way to limit support to the Democratic Party, which until the 1896 realigning election appeared to be on the upswing. But due to the First Amendment and its protections towards religious diversity, parochial schools continue to exist. The U.S. has had a Catholic president and vice president. People are free to make their own decisions concerning alcohol and Sunday enjoyments, and the United States continues its tradition of religious liberty and tolerance. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally entered World War I on the side of the British, French, Italians, and Russians against the forces of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. President Woodrow Wilson, a lifelong Anglophile who had been supporting British war efforts since the war's start in 1914, had convinced the country to go to war over the transgressions with naval foreign policy. Mobilizing over the United States geared towards a war economy. Price controls and rationing were imposed as new bureaucracies were set up to control the economy through central planning. Often these boards and committees were run by industrialists and businessmen creating a corporatist state during the late 1910s and laying the foundations for the future fascistic state in the 1930s. As the government and economy got on its war footing, so did society as anti-German prejudices arose and Congress enacted the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. These laws made it illegal to interfere with military operations or recruitment and put broad restrictions on speech that criticized the government, the flag, or the war effort. Punishments for offenses would include fines up to $10,000 or 20 years in prison. The laws were aimed at the stridently anti-war left wing, and they quickly succeeded in their intended effect. Eugene Debs, the avowed leader of the Socialist Party of America and its presidential candidate on multiple occasions, was arrested in 1918 under the Espionage Act and sentenced to a decade in prison. Under Debs's leadership, the American Socialist Party had been the only one to oppose the war as the European socialists, growing for workers' solidarity, gave way to nationalism. Debs would run his last campaign for president from his prison cell in 1920. Prisoner 9653 would receive 3.4% of the vote. In what had almost become a tradition, Congressman Victor L. Berger of Wisconsin was convicted under the Espionage Act, removed from office, and sentenced to 20 years. In California, famous author Upton Sinclair was arrested for publicly reading the Bill of Rights itself. But as it had for over a century now, the First Amendment served as a basis and a background to attack these new oppressive forces. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected president on an anti-Wilsonian platform, campaigning for a return to normalcy. Wilson and his programs were extremely unpopular with the country, and with said repulsion in mind, Harding and his pro-First Amendment opinions won with over 60% of the vote. The Sedition Act was repealed in late 1920. Congressman Berger's indictment was overturned by the Supreme Court and he returned to his seat. Harding officially pardoned Debs, an act that Wilson had refused to go through. The economy picked up as the government's newly created arms were chopped off. For another time in American history, the First Amendment was resurrected because of a deep populist backlash against government tyranny. While attacks on the First Amendment continued for the rest of the century, including the placing of Japanese Americans into concentration camps during World War II, and Senator McCarthy's "Are you or have you ever been a member of?" demagoguery of the 1950s, it is within the last decade or so that the largest battles have been fought within memory. Since the September 11th terrorist attacks of 2001 and the passing of the Patriot Act shortly after, free speech has continually become persecuted. Although instead of actively fighting it, the agents of the modern state have become more professional. Unpopular or unofficial speech is ignored by the mainstream media, and attempts to speak freely about government actions or make information public is prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917, the relic of the progressive era that was never repealed. But as technology evolved and the ability to pass information within seconds across the country has become commonplace, the First Amendment has continued the fight against federal power. Instead of being immediately maligned, such as in past events, people continue to speak and defend the amendment. Even the Supreme Court has been strict with its interpretation in recent years. Without its continued protection, people can only contemplate on how far the government would go to protect the American people from foreign terrorism. The First Amendment is arguably the best known of the entire Bill of Rights. It has kept itself close to the people's hearts and minds. That is where it hides its strength. In some cases, it can protect people from government, such as during the religious debates of the late 19th century or the scares brought on by the War on Terror. But most of the time, especially during war, the First Amendment has failed to protect speech or press from being trampled upon. What else is to be expected?
Wait.
It's words written on a flimsy piece of paper. But what gives the First Amendment strength, what makes it the most crucial amendment, is that more than any other, it gives people hope. It provides them something to fight for, something to believe in. It is a weapon with which they can beat the government back. From the Jeffersonians to the Copperheads to the old left, they have utilized the First Amendment as a battle cry to legitimize the cause for individual rights and human liberty. That is what modern patriots must keep doing. The cause of the modern patriot can be summed up in 3 quotations, then when put together, bring forth a powerful message. Liberty is an idea whose time has come. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government. Amen. Do not give in to evil, but proceed ever more boldly against it. Thank you.
Going to give these guys a chance to fix this.